Hello, the topic I've chose for my con argument is going to be inequality as far as globalization goes. And what I mean by inequality is the fact that it seems over and over that the rich seem to be getting richer while the poor are obviously getting poorer. And not only is it happening, but the gap between rich and poor is widening increasingly. Just a few numbers to look at. The 400 highest American earners in 2003 made more money than the 20 poorest African nations combined, which is a total of about 300 million people. Also, a figure from 2003, the top 10% of world earners made 117 times more money than the lowest 10% of world earners, which in 1980 was only 79 times more. Pretty clear figure there that the gap is going to be widening. And the inequality, it exists not only between different countries, but also within countries or states themselves. Rich heads of state are getting richer by exploiting their own people, teaming up with foreign investors. The investors will come in, they'll find the people who have a little bit of wealth, maybe own some land. They're the ones they're going to team up with, and then they're gonna start their factories. The government in some of these countries, they're not really acting in the interest of their people. They're obviously acting in their own interest, trying to make a dollar. I want to talk a little bit about the IMF, WTO, and the World Bank. IMF is going to be the International Monetary Fund, World Trade Organization, obviously. World Bank was actually created in post-World War II with the attempt to fix Europe and everything that was the aftermath that was World War II. But eventually they started loaning money to the poor nations throughout the world. Unfortunately, it was under one condition. In order to receive the money from the World Bank, it meant the IMF had access to the resources, any natural resources, and they also, the stipulation was everything it was mandatory that it be privatized. Anything from drinking water to air traffic control, health care, stuff along those lines. And this really created what we have now is a vicious cycle of debt among these countries. They've built up so much debt and there's so much interest that the payments that they do make, it's really not getting them anywhere. A lot of this debt is foreseen as being unpayable, basically. One of the arguments is to relieve these people of their debt and just forgive them of it, forgive these countries. However, the powers that be, they obviously don't want that to happen. A number to look at would be $100 million a day, every day, is given from the poorest countries in the world to the richest in an attempt to pay off these debts, and clearly it's not getting them very far. Another thing to look at would be the fact that the World Bank, when it first started giving out money to these countries, was actually focusing on giving money to authoritarian governments that were pro-West and pro-globalization and bringing about this new world that we know of. And the countries who were perhaps socialists or wanted to build within, they weren't given these funds, and those are the countries that are still going to be struggling today. The World Trade Organization is also, through their policies, they've made it to where there's no regulations on global companies, basically meaning companies can do what they want and they don't have to answer for anything. One way of looking at free trade is what the WTO has in their policies, where it's illegal for governments to even regulate their money, how much they make, how they make it, what they do with it. It's, it's just through their policies it's created a standard that, is the way it is. One country I want to take a quick look at and just focus on is going to be Indonesia. Again, major in textiles, other things like that. A few companies I want to look at that do have factories over there is going to be Gap and Nike. Along with the practice of sweatshops, which is very common. They like to call these economic processing zones. If you hear that word, economic processing zone, you can just go ahead and realize that that is going to be a sweatshop. That entails everything a sweatshop has: low wages, poor working conditions, long hours, everything that goes into that. There's been attempts at what they call a code of conduct, where they try to regulate, Gap or Nike has tried to regulate what goes on in these foreign factories. Obviously, they don't have any control over it. They do go visit frequently, but the employees are told by their bosses basically not to let out any information of what goes on there. So these code of conducts that have been created more or less would be useless. Another thing I wanted to look at that has helped increase the widening of the gap is just what I would consider maybe not unethical but questionable business practices. Take for instance, the value of the rupiah went down some years ago. It went way down on the value of the dollar, which actually saved Nike in their production 25% of labor cost is what it saved Nike. However, the price of shoes for us as Americans stayed the same or increased, and the wages overseas for these factory workers stayed the same. There was no increase. They received the same wages, and if the value of the rupiah went down, then their salary actually went down by getting no more money. And these are common practices amongst these countries. Indonesia is not the only one this has happened to, and it's just kind of unfortunate. Another thing I want to look at is, let's take a look at Gap. They produce all kinds of clothing. One figure I found out was about boxers. They produce these boxers over there, boxer shorts. You go into an American store in Great Britain, France, a developed country, these shorts are going to run you about $8. The amount of that goes back to that factory worker is going to be about 4 cents. While the CEO of Gap actually makes a little over $5 million a year. So that figure right there pretty much states, the gap that is, where you have the worker who makes 4 cents for each pair of boxers, and you have the CEO of the company making over $5 million. Obviously, you can't expect a factory worker in Indonesia to make the same salary as a CEO in America. However, you would think there might be a little more give and take in those practices. And then on the other hand, you have Nike. One of their big spokespersons, perhaps the biggest over the past decade, is going to be Tiger Woods. Nike actually pays Tiger Woods more in 1 year than the entire workforce that they have overseas in an entire year. Again, not saying that the entire workforce is equal to one Tiger Woods, but you can see where this gap is increasingly widening. A couple of the last figures I'd like to share with you. A well-known international investment banker is a company by the name of Goldman Sachs. In 2001, I believe, they had a revenue of $2.2 billion. And this money was actually shared between the 161 shareholders that make up the company. Interesting to that, a country by the name of Tanzania also had a year where the exact same year, 2001 I believe, they made as a nation $2.2 billion. Unfortunately, this money was split up between 25 million people. And another staggering statistic about that gap widening. Two last companies I want to look at that are just pretty interesting figures that I found was the GM and Ford. With everything that GM and Ford entails, all their employees, investors, their factories, and so on and so forth, GM as a whole is actually more profitable than the country of Denmark. And then Ford is actually bigger than South Africa, which those are two fairly big countries that two companies are actually larger than. This was just a few facts that I came across. To me, it's pretty evident that the gap between the rich and the poor is definitely widening. I know one argument for globalization is that as globalization increases, it creates more jobs, it gives people more money, it divides the wealth. But when you look at certain numbers like this, it's almost overwhelming that globalization is doing the exact opposite, and it's just allowing for the rich to make more money and the poor to get poorer. Thank you.